Welcome. My name is Joe Swimmer, and I'm the Executive Director of the SEEK Network. We are so pleased to have you with us today for this webinar, digital workshop on giving as we get into Advent, knowing that giving in this time is a little bit different than it has been in years past, where you might be thinking of your year-end strategy. We have assembled a group of thought leaders from both in the Episcopal Church and beyond the Episcopal Church, and we're looking forward to having them share with us today. Some of these folks will be with us at our conference in Atlanta next February, and we hope that you will come and join us in conversation with them there, and also for all of the other programming that we'll have. With that, I'm going to thank the panel, and I'm going to hand it off to Jim, and we look forward to hearing from you all. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Welcome to everyone. Pleased that you could join us this afternoon. I am a card-carrying Episcopalian. In fact, I led the fundraising efforts at my home parish, Christ Church Greenwich, twice. And we adhered to a calendar that was probably familiar to many of you. There was an exchange of ideas in the September timeframe between the budget and finance folks. And in October, we had a kickoff with lots of energy and enthusiasm. But I have a distinct memory both times of this time of year as we began to lurch toward the Advent season. It was a feeling of hopefulness based on some early returns, but certainly a feeling of uncertainty. We could see the light out there from a fundraising perspective, but we weren't particularly close to success. It was a mixture of confidence and anxiety. And of course, we were engaging in that delicate balance of trying to collect and finish on this year's pledges with some of the same people we were going to make sure next year was going to be a success. So that Advent imagery for annual fundraising of moving from the darkness to the light, I think, still holds. But today, for those of you charged with similar responsibilities, you've got some additional complexities to consider as we emerge from COVID. From a fundraising perspective, what is the new normal? Well, one of my favorite priests, Andrew Kryzak, who's now down at a parish in the Washington area, says rather strongly that COVID really didn't change anything. It may have amplified some trends that were already going on. It may have raised up for consideration things we didn't want to face. But actually, COVID's a great opportunity to redefine new normal for the church in every respect, to think about our programs, to think about services, to think about our member engagement, and yes, to think about fundraising and how we're going to do that. So I picked up on Andrew's theme to try to think outside of the box. And I went to two folks from outside of our tradition, the Reverend Larry Strenge and Joe Park. We're very fortunate to have two fundraising experts with us today from outside of our own tradition. Larry comes from the evangelical Lutheran tradition. He was a commodity broker before he and his wife started doing some mission work, which eventually led them to seminary and to ordination. And Larry's spent most of his time serving the synod in Minnesota in a variety of different roles. But back in the 2008-2009 era, he started doing some work with the Lake Institute, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. And the result was a refocusing of his own ministry on the ministry of fundraising. Joe Park comes to us from what might be described as the Wesleyan traditions. He was a successful financial executive who joined the board of Horizons Stewardship, a consulting firm founded by the great Cliff Christopher, a well-known person in fundraising circles for churches, who had founded Horizons as a consulting firm to help churches and other not-for-profits fund their ministries. Well, I don't know whether Joe drank the Kool-Aid or he was given the Kool-Aid, but eventually he transitioned from a board position to CEO, and Horizons has blossomed under his leadership. They have raised more than $7 billion, that's billion with a B, for their clients in terms of funding their ministries. Now, on the surface, Larry and Joe come from different perspectives. In addition to the denominational differences I already mentioned, you've got the ordained leader, you've got the lay leader, you've got somebody who spent most of his time in the upper Midwest, you've got somebody who's got a national practice but spent a lot of time in the South and Southeast. But I think you're going to find that they're in violent agreement on at least one principle, and I think that'll come out today, that the job one of any church and every church is to make disciples. And if you're successful in thinking about and making disciples, a lot of other things, including fundraising, will fall into place. So today I asked Larry and Joe to give us some formal remarks, and they have a presentation for you so you can get a better sense of their orientation. And then I'm going to try and moderate a conversation with them, between and among them, before answering some of the questions that come out from you, the audience. And with that, if it sounds good to all of you, I'll turn it over to Larry.
All right. Thank you, Jim. Well, those of you who are in the gathering may be familiar with that picture on the left of the slide. That is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther. The guy on the right is a guy who's played him over 500 times during his last 10 years as the Director for Evangelical Mission in the Southwestern Minnesota Synod of the ELCA. And I had the joy of playing Martin for all these years. It was always a great way to get into parishes where I was coming as that, in your case, the diocese person. We called them synods, and to be able to break into that and share some of the teachings that Martin brought to the Lutheran tradition. Especially, I wanted to bring him up today because, Joe, if you go to the next slide, today happens to be Martin's birthday, November 10th, 1483. So he's 538 years old today. And I thought it was very appropriate, as we are talking about giving and Advent, and the word Advent meaning coming, and the whole, at least in our tradition, the Lutheran tradition, this is really a part of the apocalyptic kind of time, the end of time things, the revealing, that is. And for Martin, there was that revealing that came through the Greek word eleutherios. It means the free one, but you'll see from the letters that I've highlighted on that Greek word, he had a change in his name from his boyhood name of Martin Luther to Martin Luther, to reflect that word through his whole life, so that when people would say his name, it actually meant the free one. And this is what he discovered. It was the key thing. And I want to, and he took that from that biblical passage, John 8. It was he was a key teacher of the Psalms, of the Galatians and John in his teaching career as a doctor of theology and professor of Bible at Wittenberg University. But this thing of freedom was so huge in his background, and he wanted that to come across. And so, next slide, please, Joe. He really started the Reformation based on the proper role of money in people's lives. In other words, to set them free to be the people that God had created them to be. And what I mean by that was that during that time, there was a fundraising campaign going on. In other words, a capital campaign, the kind of thing that Joe, our friend Joe Park here, would help you to do with the Horizons Stewardship. And but they were not doing it very well, at least not in Martin's opinion. And if you'd go to the next slide, Joe, this was that they were using the sale of indulgences. Now, in case you're not familiar with indulgences, please, next slide, Joe. Indulgences were a bank account of good deeds or merits that the saints and the apostles had done by their good deeds, and the Roman Catholic Church had a bank of them that they could hand out, that they could take out it. People could get on out of the deposit, and they could buy these merits, so that their soul that was in purgatory, that is the place between earthly realm and the place of God's grace, heaven, that you would land in between. Now, there was only one exit from purgatory, and that was to the place of grace, to heaven. But you could suffer in this place. And these preachers of indulgences were really good at telling you how you were going to suffer in those places. And so the sale of indulgences was raising money like crazy. And this just drove Martin nuts, because as he said in what is called Theses 62, there were 95 of them, and I'll teach you about that in just a moment here. He said this: the true treasure of the church is the most holy gospel of glory and the grace of God. The true treasure that the church has to offer is the good news of the gospel and the grace of God that sets us back to that theme of setting us free. Next slide, Joe. And so when Johann Tetzel, who was the chief salesperson for this capital campaign that was going on for the raising of the money for the church in Rome, was out there doing this fundraiser, it just drove Martin nuts. Next slide, please. When he began to say this: "When the coin in the coffer clings, the soul to heaven flings." And this just drove Martin crazy, because of course the people in his parish were going out and hearing this kind of stuff and doing this, and it just drove him crazy. Next slide, please. And so this is what ended up on October 31st, 1517, that he went and he put up what we have commonly, at least in the Lutheran tradition, called the 95 Theses. I'm not sure what in the Episcopal Church you call them, but they were actually called this because they were a scholarly document. They were Martin Luther's disputation for clarifying the power and efficacy of indulgences. So he was talking about what's the proper use of money. What is the proper use of money? And the thing went wild. That is, he wrote a sermon on indulgences and grace. 5,000 copies of it sold. He became the most popular writer in Europe, and his name was, was just famous all over the place throughout Europe. Next slide, please. But what it came down to was this: that then, back in 1517, this whole Reformation era that started then, and in time that Martin lived and beyond, then and now, in the time that we're in right now, in this liminal time, this time of great change in the church's work is to help people be what? The free ones. To set them free from those other gods. And that really is the key work that we as lay people, as clergy, and it's interesting for me as a Lutheran to go into the Episcopalian terms for clergy, priests, vicar, all of those kinds of things. And I want to deeply appreciate that in the role that each of you play, and lay persons play in the structure of the church. Today, you'll probably hear me from time to time use clergy or pastor, just because it'll be a little bit easier. In the ELCA, we actually talk about rostered ministers now. That is a minister of word and sacrament. That would be more commonly called a pastor. And our deacons are ministers of word and service. So we might have some of those words in common. But anyway, that work of lay persons and clergy persons today, I believe, in this proper use of money, is to help people be the free ones. And what does that mean? It means this: to move us out of a consumer culture mentality to live into a gospel culture mentality. And this is deeply about how people use their time, their talents, and especially their money. So I want to just spend a few minutes of the time that I have remaining to talk about that how in this Advent season. As Jim mentioned at the start of this, one of the key things that happened in my life was the transformation that came when I began working with the Lake Institute, and was trained to be one of their adjunct faculty in the course they called Cultivating Generous Congregations. And in that, one of the key moments in the sessions that we spend with rostered leaders, with pastors and the teams, their stewardship teams that come to these, is teaching them about the pyramid of giving, and then sending them home and then coming back and getting their feedback. So what's the pyramid of giving? Well, you see it there in front of you. It's a tool that can be used in descriptive ways, in prescriptive ways, and diagnostic ways to look at your parish. And so I'm going to use for simple purposes that each of your parishes has 100 household units. And a household unit can be a single person, can be a married couple, whatever configuration you want to use. But we sometimes use giving units in the ELCA. But what you do with this is those 100, and you would take who are the top 10% of donors. Now, something that Joe and I have talked about that we think is very important, and I believe Jim is on board with this as well, is that we believe that our clergy need to know what people's giving is. It's very important that this is a very important matter today. And I know that we get pushback on this about people say, well, I don't want to treat people differently in that, this is such. I am convinced that this is such an important thing, and that we're trained as clergy to be able to, deal with a variety of things in people's lives, to be able to keep those things confidential. But it opens the door to have these important conversations, to move from a consumer culture to a gospel culture by knowing this information. Because what I'm going to get to here in a moment is one way that could happen in our Advent season. So to know who that top 10% of givers would be, then to know who the next 20% of givers. So now you know the top 30%. Now, here's something that I want to make very clear. This is something that we teach in our Cultivating Generous Congregations course. Just because you're in the bottom 70% doesn't mean that you're not one of the top givers in the church. In other words, it's not strictly by numbers of dollars. In other words, there may be, I think it's this Sunday that we have the widow's mite in our parishes, and we all know that it is not the total number of dollars, but it has to do with the sacrifice that people give. And so you might see somebody in that bottom 70% of dollars given, for example, who makes very little in terms of money, or has very few assets, but they might be somebody who gives a lot of time. They might be somebody who gives in a percentage basis a large amount, and so we would want them to be talked about in what I'm going to talk about next here. But to analyze this so that we know who we can have this conversation with. And so, Joe, I'm going to ask you to go to the next slide, please. In the Lake Institute, we talk about that there need to be 4 mindset shifts that take place in the life of the parish to develop that culture of generosity. The first is this idea that generosity or stewardship needs to be about discipleship. That's what Jim mentioned at the beginning, that Joe and I are both the Horizons Stewardship, and we in the ELCA and in the Lake Institute would absolutely believe that stewardship or generosity conversations are about discipleship, of making disciples, and doing that in a way that people realize that the way that they use their time, their talents, their abilities, their money, this is about a part of their discipleship journey, that they're growing as disciples as they learn how to do that. The second principle is that there's a move from a scarcity thinking to either abundance or sufficiency or abounding. I like those words more. I found, because I've been so engaged with Lynn Twist in her work in the book The Soul of Money, that I've kind of come to be like Lynn, that I don't like the word abundance so much, except when I'm talking about God's abundance. But when we talk about our abundance, it can get to be kind of a difficult concept. And I think the biblical idea of sufficiency, like Paul hearing "my grace is sufficient for you," is something that works better. But anyway, that move, and why do I say that? Because in our culture, we've been swimming in a scarcity mentality from the moment we're born. And this is coming right out of my understanding of what Lynn Twist would talk about in The Soul of Money, that we have a scarcity mindset, and the toxic myths of scarcity break down to these 3 things. There isn't enough, more is better, and that's just the way that it is. And so you can hear it in there. There isn't enough. It's a zero-sum game. And so We need to break that mentality. More is better. And this is something that we, again, want to move people to, that grace is better, that not more and accumulating more is better because there isn't enough. And then finally, to break out of that cynicism of that's just the way that it is, to the message that we as the church have to give to people, that we are the free ones, that resurrection is the way that it is. Now, if you got to know me better, you'd know that Elizabeth and I lost a son about 7 years ago. And there was just a huge transformation that took place as we began to learn about how God provided that sufficient grace in that time. And to move out of that to move into, to live into that whole idea of resurrection is the way that it is. And especially as we confess in the Apostles' Creed, I believe in the resurrection of the body, that we're going to, that's a message of the gospel. Well, the third one is money follows mission. And so in this Advent time, now we're going to move into a couple of specifics here of how one can use the pyramid of giving. Make sure that we're telling the story. Every week, we're telling the story of what God has done. And if that means that the clergy person in your parish has gone out and made 10 visits to people that are shut in, and she or he can come in and say, wow, this week when I was out, I was visiting with somebody and I brought the Eucharist to this person, and this person began to cry because they realized that they were receiving the body and blood of Jesus. And I want you to know that you made that possible. So when you give your offering today, that's what you're doing. And I want to thank you for that. Now, that money follows mission is something that we can do every week. In other words, let's stop this, 6 weeks of stewardship thing. I've gotten to know Charles Clowen and his 1 minute stewardship, and I so appreciate how he talks about it. He had a great quote in there. He says, today, we need year-round stewardship education based on a theology of abundance and gratitude. That's wonderful. That's just wonderful way to think about it, that every week. And I know I've in our ELCA, we've been trying to get people, and we teach this in our Cultivating Generous Congregations, the importance of having a moment of thanksgiving at the offering. And you heard me demonstrate it just a moment ago. And Elizabeth and I, because we were both pastors, we didn't often get to go to worship together. But when we would go together, we went to this church one Sunday, and they had this moment of thanksgiving. And the pastor did something like just what I did there, showing a slide with these 4 young people with children around and saying, these 4 young people are working with our young people, and they're teaching them about Jesus and what it means to be free in Jesus. And so I want to thank you right now for the offering that you're going to give, and invite you to give generously. What was that? It was informing, it was motivating, it was inviting, and it was thanking, all in about 30 seconds. And what happened to us was that we sat there in the pew and went, wow, this is what we were going to give. We want to give more. We want to support that. And that's what that moment, money follows mission, telling the story, giving that. And then finally, generosity fundraising about relationships. And this is where I really want to encourage in this Advent season that you would think very seriously about starting a campaign with that top 10% at least, who those top 10 are, and maybe get down into that next 20% and have a conversation. Here's the question that I would invite you, especially as the clergy in here, or you that are going to bring this back to other people, to encourage your clergy person to use, and that would be, who taught you to be generous? Who taught you to be generous? Just start with that. It is a wonderful conversation starter, and then begin to listen. That's what Henry Nouwen talks about in A Spirituality of Fundraising. And in case you haven't heard an endorsement for that, I want to give another one for it, especially the workbook edition that Nathan Ball did on it, and encourage you to do that. I'm going to end with a story and then turn it over to Joe. The story is Carol of the Sea. And it has to do with when we begin to practice the things that I was just talking about: generosity, stewardship is discipleship, a movement from scarcity to abundance, money follows mission. Amazing things happen. So, and how fundraising is about relationships. So we were at the Lake Institute to get some training, and three of us went out for lunch before the conference started, before our training started at this gathering. And we went to an Irish pub, and we were seated outside, and it was a lunch, and this woman came out, and she says, "Hi, I'm Kara with a C." And we said, "Well, hi, Kara." And the next thing she said to us was this. She says, "Tell me something interesting about yourself." Well, we all said something, but Dwayne, who was with us, said, "My wife and I last Sunday celebrated our 36th year of marriage." Kara went ballistic. She went, "Wow, that's fantastic." She says, "We got to celebrate that." And she headed inside. She came back a moment later with a little plank, and it had 4 shots of Jameson on it. Well, she could see that we had no idea, we Lutheran types, on how to do this. So she says, "The way you do this is you don't sip it. You take it and you smack it down, and then you throw it back in your mouth." Well, she says, "Okay, go." So we did this, and we're coughing and all this kind of stuff. Well, the night goes on from there. We had some beers with our lunch, and or I guess it was dinner. It was the evening, and Kara comes. Kara's laughing about this. Well, she comes out with the bill, and she says, "I want you to know that the beers that you had, they're on me." And my friend Dwayne says, "Oh, you don't have to do that." Kara's response was this: "Don't tell me how I can be generous. I want to be generous." That's the whole idea. People want to experience the joy of generosity. And by generosity or fundraising through those relationships, by having those kinds of relationships that we can have in a parish to ask that question, who taught you to be generous? By telling stories of money follows mission, of moving out of that scarcity to more of a sufficiency or abounding theology, and remembering that this is about discipleship, that's going to begin to happen. So blessed Advent to you as you begin this season of asking the question, who taught you to be generous? Thank you.
Larry, I appreciate the comments that you had, and agree with your statements. We're harmonized on that. As you heard earlier, I'm Joe Park, CEO of Horizons Stewardship, and one of the resources that we have at Horizons is called Giving 365. You can find it at giving365.com. And I'm going to be where Larry was working on big picture and theology. I'm going to be working on specific strategies. And I want you to know that I'm going to be covering it really quickly so we can get to the question part. But I want you to know that everything I'm talking about, there's a resource in Giving 365 for that, that you can connect to in an ebook, a blog, a video, a webinar. So there's a QR code here at the end of my presentation. We'll be back with that if you want to use it, or you can just go to Giving 365 and we will connect with you and give you free access to that. So I've got 6 strategies, and the first one is to understand the philanthropic landscape. There are many bad assumptions out there, and I want to just lay very quickly some of this information out here. You can go to Giving USA and see all the data points that come from this, and we also have webinars where we've unpacked it and what it means to the church. But essentially, giving has been growing about 5% a year since 1980, even before that. And so that's the good news. Giving is going up. The challenge is that in 1980, really in 1989, about 58% of all charitable giving came to the church, and that had fallen to 29% last year. So not only is there a long-term decrease in the percent of giving that's coming to the church, that is accelerating, and we're going to talk about a couple of points as to why that is. One of the big ones is there's 1.3 million, actually more than that, 501c3s that are competing for the same dollars, and they are doing a really good job of making compelling ask upon our best donors. And this is one of the primary reasons that you see giving struggling in the church. Now, Americans, we're not really becoming more generous. We're giving the same 2% of our gross domestic product, 2% of our disposable income that we have been really since World War II, flat as a pancake. The rise is that Americans are becoming more prosperous, and as they are, we're giving the same amount, but where that giving is coming from is changing pretty radically. One of the things you need to know is that fewer households are giving, and this shift is happening fast. Here's a chart that shows giving in 2016 compared to 2017 compared to 2020 over just a 3-year period of time. You can see that depending on the different category, there's a significant shift in giving patterns. Over just 3 years, households earning less than $40,000, 17% simply dropped out of the charitable giving market. It gets less and less as we go forward, but we now know that the amount of our wealth is being given, and it's a consistent amount. There are fewer people contributing to that. So that's at fewer households. So each household becomes more valuable. More is coming from the top 10%. There's more engaged there. And as a group, the top 10% is continuing to grow in the amount that they're giving. And that's not really true of the other giving categories. So if your parish is made up of folks that make $100,000 or greater, that's great news. If you've got a parish that is of more limited means, then that is problematic, and it's something that you will be facing, and we need to embrace the realities of that. Now, part of that's being driven just in the plain shift of wealth. 17% of wealth has shifted from the bottom 90% to the upper 10%. And over the last few years, with the tax changes that have happened, it's really concentrating in the upper 1%. Again, great news if that's who you have in your church. Less good news if it's not who you're principally seeing as your core donors. Now, the reason that number is falling as rapidly as it is partially because of what I talked about. But the biggest piece is your very best donors are giving less and less of what they give away to the church. That's the challenge. What used to come to us is not coming to us today. And so it is incredibly important that we focus on growing a culture of generosity, but those major donors which are really the lifeblood of most churches, and we'll talk about that. Larry showed it in his illustration. They are moving away from you if you are not working really hard at building relationships with them. We'll cover that later. Now, Larry got into this, Jim got into this. At Horizons, we believe that generosity is a byproduct of the discipleship path. Folks say, well, how do we raise more money? And the answer is, as a church, do your job, make disciples, change the world. And that will be the greatest fundraising effort that you can have, the generosity development effort that you can have. And by discipleship, I mean worship, spiritual formation, serving. And I would encourage every church to have this discipleship pathway that you are laying out, and include in it generosity or giving. Make sure that it's clear that it's financial giving that you're talking about. And so there's no bait and switch. You're not asking people to join the church and then springing on them this annual campaign and throwing out things like tithing when you didn't bring that up earlier. But I want to show you how profound profoundly impactful discipleship and specifically the engagement in the discipleship is in terms of giving. So one of the very largest United Methodist Church used a data scientist to do a study on the giving patterns of their almost 20,000 members. And what they learned is that those people who attend worship at least one time a month, but less than or up to twice a month, give about 1% of their income. So we see just across the mainline churches, that's about what the average mainline donor gives. Episcopalians, you're a little older, you've got more builders who give a higher percentage, but across the board, think about it, it's about 1%. Now, when people attend worship twice or more, they double their giving to the church. So just on the worship piece, getting people to attend worship more than twice a month will in fact have the result of increasing their giving because of the additional investment of time and energy that they are making. And don't forget that online is worship. If you are not doing peer-in worship, if you're engaging people in worship, you can build those trends with your online donors. In fact, online actually provides the opportunity to increase the number of times that somebody comes to worship. The more convenient you make it for them online or on demand, the more times that they're going to come to worship. And we've seen that expanding, interestingly enough, in the boomers and the Gen Xers. But look at this. If you can get someone to be actively engaged in spiritual formation, and the component that's important to know about this is there's a sense of community. So whether it's a small group in home, whether it's a Sunday school class, whether it's a Bible study where you are caring for each other, or they get involved in a hands-on ministry, not a committee of the church, but a hands-on ministry of the church, they give 3.5 times more, or 3.5% of their income, which happens to be 3.5 times more than that person who attends worship twice a month. So if you don't walk away with anything else, know that if you are struggling with giving and you are not sold out to developing a clear discipleship path, that is your starting place. So next strategy, finish strong in 2021. December is the biggest giving month for nonprofits and for churches. About 1/3 of all giving is taking place during this window of time. And the very last week of the month is the biggest week of giving. If you are not addressing your donors in this last week, inviting them to give, and most particularly to give to something specific that is not to fund necessarily the ministry budget of the church, but potentially parts of that, like outreach parts beyond the doors of the church, can come into your ministry budget, but that's where these dollars would be sent. You are missing out on a significant opportunity to first onboard new donors and secondly grow those, because they're giving. If you're not reaching out, they simply are just not giving to you. Giving Tuesday, which is November 30th, is the biggest single day of the year related to giving. It grew 20% year over year. And churches that are engaged in this are seeing fantastic returns. So how do you do that? Horizons has created a year-end giving guide. It's in Giving 365. You can use the QR code there to hit it, but it talks about 6 different strategies to finish the year well, from how to educate your donors on donor advised funds and charitable giving and remainder, tax advantage giving, to how to structure those year-end communication pieces, how to set up for Giving Tuesday. It is simply a cookbook, and churches that followed that last year reported absolutely stunning results, or they were stunned at the results that came from that. So the next is funding your 2020 ministry budget. So we're shifting from what you do in this calendar year to what you're going to be doing next year. And if you have not already done an annual giving campaign, I would encourage you to do that if that's your tradition. And for most mainline churches, it is. My best recommendation is that you consider doing that in the January and February timeframe. Horizons leads hundreds of these a year. Most of the churches that we're leading are experiencing double-digit increases in year-over-year giving. There are case studies in Giving 365 of churches that are doing that. And it is, I believe, the best time of the year to do that is in January and February. So if you have not already accomplished it and you are just setting that aside this year, you're actually just coming into the season, and I'd encourage you to jump on that. When you're doing it, focus on the donor's need to be generous versus the church's need to receive money. This is that spiritual pathway that I'm talking about. It's the difference between creating a culture of generosity and discipleship and fundraising. Fundraising just talks about the need, but when you make it about a spiritual conversation between the donor and God, and it is primarily a reflection of their relationship and God's goodness in our life, you will have a better result. Only use, and this is critically important, only use percentage giving and tithing when you describe any kinds of amounts. Don't say vague things like give a little more, give what you can. Please don't say we've increased our budget by 3% next year, so we're asking you to increase your giving by 3%. So if I'm giving you $100 a month, you've only asked me to increase my giving by 3%, and you shun it off that conversation that I need to have through the Holy Spirit to really examine where God wants my giving to be. So that's important. Use estimate of giving rather than pledges or commitments when it comes to your annual giving, because if you're using percentage giving and somebody says, okay, well, I'm going to move from 1% to 2%, and remember, that's a doubling of giving for most mainline churches. But if you ask them, so we're going to ask everybody here to prayerfully consider doubling their giving, they would let their hair on fire and run out the door. But if you say, we're going to ask everyone to prayerfully consider increasing their giving by 1 or more percent. Don't limit what God may have in store for them as you work toward a tithe or extravagant offerings beyond a tithe, then people will hear that, they will begin to do it, and that's where you see that extraordinary change. Don't lose that word operating budget. Don't have an operating budget. Nobody wants to give to the operating fund. They want to fund ministry. You shouldn't be doing anything that's not ministry. And so just call it a ministry budget. Look for 100% participation, even if that means asking people to put a 0 on their estimate of giving card. And then do an active follow-up. Let people know that you are, that the leaders of the church, the vestry would be the best one, are going to be following up with people who are regularly engaged in the life of the church. Don't do this to your non-givers. Do it to people who are engaged in the church, to see what questions they ask, how you can pray for them, and to encourage the return of the card, because they can put 0 on the card. The trick is, most people know that's not the right answer, but they don't get frustrated with the church, because the church already said if that's what they prayed about and came to that conclusion, that's okay with us. The problem is when they sit down and they're talking to God about it, that is an opportunity for the Holy Spirit to move in their life and have a different life change. Year-round generosity, Larry touched on this. Stop fundraising, start developing cultures of generosity, and use the disciplines that are essentially, Horizons has worked with thousands of churches, raised billions of dollars, and we've come up with these 6 basic disciplines that everything we do falls into one of these. Now, there are dozens of strategies of how to do it, but keep it simple. Tell your ministry story. build donor relationships, make clear, measurable asks, measure the effectiveness of what you're doing, and build trust and accountability. Again, in Giving 365, there are dozens and dozens of resources on each one of these. And I'm going to finish up with high impact strategies. These are things, if you are not doing these in your church, regardless of your size, then you have an opportunity, a low hanging fruit, because each one of these is relatively easy to do, but with a big return. And that is build a generosity team. Most folks are coming at it from the perspective of building a stewardship team. So you ask people who know money to try to raise money in the church. And the problem is, to raise money in the church, we have to raise discipleship, and we're talking about a cultural change. Well, the finance committee or the stewardship committee doesn't have the authority or the influence to do that in and of themselves. So a generosity team is needed. This is a multicultural, multidisciplinary kind of team that's made up of someone from your pastoral staff, somebody from your worship team, somebody from your small group, somebody from your serving ministry, somebody from your communication team, somebody from your finance team, somebody from your vestry, and they are empowered by the vestry to talk about changes which are going to change the culture. And that's how it happens. If you don't have a clear theology of generosity where you've laid out what actual words means and you're using those terms correctly, like tithe, 10%, percentage giving, the difference in offering, that's a gift over and above a tithe. When you have a clear theology of generosity, then your communication team and everybody who talks about generosity is you playing off the same sheet of music, and you don't send these mixed messages which confuse people in the pews who think that whatever I drop in the offering plate, that's my tithe. Well, they have a complete misunderstanding of what the tithe would be. So that's easy to fix. Again, lots of resources and materials and webinars on that. Weekly offering talks. It is your most powerful tool. Larry talked about that, building cultures of generosity, telling your story 52 times a year. You want to do that. Got to have a strategy specifically for your ministry and financial leaders. It isn't electronic giving, it's recurring giving. That's the critical piece. Structured gifts. And so we have churches that have over 90% of their income pre-planned because people have already set it up to come in. It comes in automatically to the churches. And imagine how easy it is to budget and know what your cash flow is going to be. Imagine how grand it is over the course of the summer when you've got that level of giving, and you can run campaigns on it. We have materials on how to do that. You can contact us. We can help you. You've got to touch first-time donors, not just one time saying thanks, but engage them on the second time they do it and the third time that they do it. And you're drawing them into the engagement process. So that third call may be, hey, I'd like to invite you to my Sunday school class. That's how you draw people into the life of the church. Donor analytics. If you're a church that's worshiping over 100, you really should consider this. The cost is way down. Horizons works with a number of companies that provide these, and we can help you set those up. We don't provide them ourselves. They are, you would sign a contract with those companies. We just help you use them effectively. You've got to educate your donors so they understand what you're asking for and how best to give, and you must develop trust, transparency, and accountability. So I know that was super fast. What I'm telling you is, if you will go to Giving 365, look at these slides when you get them emailed to you along with this recording. You're going to be able to look up under each of those topics information on how you can continue to grow. There are chat features that you can reach out. At Horizons, we're happy to have somebody contact you and just talk you through that because we're all in this together. Jim, back to you.
Thank you so much, Joe. Thank you, Larry. I might start out, because you both emphasized the importance of major gifts in your talks, to ask both of you what is the right thing to do during the last sort of 6 to 8 weeks of the year to keep in touch with those critical donors? Is there anything you would do differently between now and year end?
Well, I know I would be contacting at the very least a phone call. And in COVID, that's probably what it's going to be. But just contacting them, and I heard Joe saying this over and over, and we both so agree on this. You cannot wear out thank you. You can't wear it out. The more times you say it, the more times you tell your story, and the more times that you thank people for supporting your story, the better. So that's where I'd start, and that's where that pyramid of giving comes in. If you need, it's just overwhelming to think of, oh, I've got a whole parish to go. No, just start with look at it, analyze it, and figure out who those people are.
So that's something you can do between now and the end of the year. That year-end giving guide talks about how you can structure those communications and segment them so your ministry and financial leaders are getting different communication than you're sending to others. But we're also talking about how to launch into next year and building relationship with these authentic relationships with these donors based on what you want for them and not from them. Henry Nouwen is a great book. If you have not read the book that Larry recommended, I would encourage you to do that. But in those relationships, solicit their wisdom. They have wisdom. Ask them questions. You want to pay special attention to how engaged they are. Are they attending worship, engaged in a small group? Are they serving? And a lot of your high capacity donors, they're not going to serve on a big team or committee. So find something that they can do. Help them solve a problem for you, and then let your vestry empower them to guide to a solution. They love that kind of engagement, and it draws them into those relationships. The thing I'd want to say, and we haven't talked about it, is planned giving. If you can get a donor to remember the church as a child or a grandchild in their estate plan, they will double on average their giving to the church over the rest of their life. So it doesn't take from that, it adds to it. And your financial leaders are the ones easiest to have those conversations with.
Thanks, Joe. One of our participants has asked in the chat room how you incorporate time and talent in addition to treasure in fundraising and pledge drives. Joe, I wonder if you have any thoughts on that before we go back to Larry and hear his.
Yeah, let me start with a caution. We completely believe in holistic generosity, time, talent, and treasures. And what has happened in the mainline church, and really even in the evangelical church, is pastors have fallen off the other side of the horse trying to make the point that we want you to be generous in all areas. But what Barna did a study on it, and what your donors are hearing, particularly your Gen Xers and millennials, are time, talent, or money. And they're hearing us talk in soft pedal. That's that make a very clear ask. And what they're doing is substituting one for the other. And that's not really growing. We're all entrusted with a certain amount of time, talent, and treasures, and we're responsible for stewarding all of it. So I encourage you to be very careful when you do that. Don't leave it out, but make sure you are being clear that it's not a smorgasbord, that God is wanting us to steward all the resources we have.
That in Lutheran circles, we call that the doctrine of vocation. Live into all of those. And, and we're just, in our culture, of course, we're not very good at talking about money. We avoid talking about money. And that's why what you're hearing from us is open it up, talk about it, but and I've tried to give that one question. I have so much positive feedback from people that I've worked with, coached, where I've, told them, here's what I want you to do. Go out, ask one question. Who taught you to be generous? Oh my goodness. It just opens up, you got to follow up questions, but I'm not going to predict what those are going to be. The Holy Spirit will take care of that.
You made a pretty strong case during your opening remarks that the rector needs to know who's giving for practical reasons. But the truth is, some rectors are more comfortable and some less comfortable in actually asking for money. Do you have any advice on how to be supportive of him or her without undermining their authority and still get the job done if the job effectively is falling to the volunteers?
Yeah, I think that the first place I would go with that is that even if the rector doesn't want to know the amount, know who the people are who are the most supportive, and that's enough. That's enough to get the conversation started. So I just think that as clergy people, we know so much about people's lives, and I'm not going to judge somebody differently because they've had a divorce or their sexual preference is different than anyway, those kinds of things. I'm going to listen. That's what I'm trained to do. So I think that's where I'd start, was even if you don't want to know the amounts, to know who those generous people are. Because again, the most important words are thank you, thank you, thank you.
Joe, I want to turn back to you, because at Horizons Stewardship, you help lots of different organizations, not just churches. And I know some you help in terms of capital campaigns, some you help in annual fundraising. Do you have any advice or thoughts for how you conduct annual fundraising when you are also conducting a capital campaign? Do you do anything differently?
Every setting is different. As a rule of thumb, it's difficult to be in the first year of a capital campaign and also be asking for a large increase in ministry giving. That can be a heavy lift. So if you're planning to do, my preference is to separate the two. But if the timing is such that you do it together, and we do it together quite frequently, you have to decide with your ministry budget what your expectations for growth are there. And that's got to be your primary focus, making sure that the ministry budget is funded, that you're asking people to make gifts over and above. And I'll tell you this, that what people give to the ministry budget is a gift that keeps on giving. When a capital campaign expires, those gifts don't flow back into the operating budget of the church. I just said that word, operating budget, to the ministry budget of the church. They get spent in other ways or given to other places, which is why it really is, if you're not having a capital campaign, then those are dollars you're not getting. But the priority's got to be the ministry budget of the church. If you have a big capital campaign need that you're doing, we typically say, let's limit the growth in pressure in the first year, just the first year of the typically a 3-year giving cycle to the ministry budget. That way you can really now focus on the capital campaign. I tell you what folks are doing now, and it's one of the most common capital campaigns we're in right now, is to actually reduce debt. for churches that have debt service in their ministry budgets to be able to pull. We typically recommend leave the interest in there so that those over and above gifts that are going to reduce debt are going 100% to reduce the principal. But it takes that principal reduction out of the ministry budget, allows you some freedom to expand ministry in the ministry budget. You're getting dollars you wouldn't have otherwise gotten on the capital side. And as Americans have reduced their debt levels during COVID, they are anxious to give to debt reduction capital campaigns. They are just doing really, really well right now. So that may be more than you ask, but there's an answer.
Great, Joe. Well, we're coming up toward the top of the hour. Another question from the chat room regards interim pastors. Larry, maybe this is one you could handle. When a parish or a congregation is in transition, how involved should an interim pastor be in fundraising? Should they know about amounts and how do they plug in effectively here?
Well, I think that interims are just such important people in the ministry of our churches, and to come in and try to change something though that has been a practice can maybe not. I guess this is where I'm going to go back to my last answer, is that maybe not know the amounts if that's not the practice in the parish, but to know who the people are, that absolutely, because I don't think that's interims want to be able to. It's a great way to go out and have a conversation. Again, I'm going to go back to my question. Can you think of anything better than to go out to those top 10% of givers and say, wow, who taught you to be generous? That's a great way to keep the juices going for the work that Jesus calls us to do.
And Joe, how about you and the experience at Horizons with interims? How do you feel?
We actually see interims leading or initiating generosity efforts as part of the transformation. They can get away with making some changes and taking some of those steps that the new rector may not be as excited to come in and immediately have a capital campaign before them. I am a firm believer that senior pastors and key pastors need to know the giving in the church. There's so many, if you don't know, there's so many opportunities you will miss to say thank you, to notice a difference, to know who to engage. I don't know really how you can. I don't know a really generous church where the pastors are not actively engaged working with the donor list in the church. So that would be the same for an interim, but every year we probably have interim pastors lead a generosity effort. Maybe it is designing a year-round generosity plan, or a capital campaign, because debt principally is standing in the way. And so they can absolutely do it, but before we leave, we test. So sometimes the interims just don't have the connection or the ability to lead. And that shows up in the feasibility study. So you're not stepping into something that you can't pull off. Always do a feasibility study before launching into a campaign.
Joe, Larry, I can't thank you enough for sharing your time and your wisdom with us today. I want to thank you again on behalf of SEEP and on behalf of all Episcopalians. You've given us a lot to think about here, and we really appreciate you taking the time to do that.
Jim, thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Well, thanks everyone, and have a terrific Advent, and we'll see you soon.